let me just give a very brief about the Common Core. The Common Core is not a federal program. It was, there have been many efforts to come up with state standards for education by the individual states, and then nationally there was No Child Left Behind, NCLB. But Common Core, people looked at, a very small group of people looked at those state standards and found two opposite things. That the state standards were in one sense overstuffed, that every expert wanted his or her subject discussed, so the scope and sequence demanded that teachers do things they absolutely couldn't do. They were unreal. And on the other hand, partially due to the way No Child Left Behind was structured, states were completely incommensurate. The famous example is that a Mississippi 12th grader was a Massachusetts 8th grader. So in 2010, this group got together and said, let's try to figure out where students need to be in their skills, not in their curricular subjects, in year 13. When they graduate from high school, what kinds of skills do they need to have? And based on backforming from where students need to be, what kind of reading, writing, thinking, speaking skills they need in year 13, they backformed year by year to develop really a K-12 arc for English language arts. A parallel structure was done for math. And just this year, a third structure called Next Generation Science was issued that was meant to weave with the math standards. So when we speak of Common Core broadly, there are those three standards. However, what I'm going to talk about today is entirely ELA, English Language Arts. I don't know if you are going to either. This is the dirty little secret. We call it Common Core, but we mean ELA. Now, so this was proposed by a group of actually 3 people, and it was proposed to the National Governors Conference. And each governor had the choice whether his or her state was going to switch over to the Common Core standards or continue to use the standards they have, and also had the choice of would they take all 3, 2, or 1. 46 states adopted the ELA standards. 45 states adopted the math standards. There has, however, been some resistance. This year, the Tea Party made the Common Core its issue. It's sort of translated version of Obamacare, defining it as a federal imposition, even though it is not a federal imposition. And then there are also assessments for these Common Core skills that were not developed by that small group, but are being developed by 2 different consortia. Each state picks which consortium to use and also picks when to first give the assessments. That's a broad picture. Any questions about that before we jump in? Peggy, you want to add, qualify, change? Okay. So this is the big picture of the Common Core assessments from New Jersey's point of view. New Jersey is giving its first Common Core assessments this spring. So for New Jersey to get a sense of where it is on the Common Core, a reasonable thing to do is to look at New York, which gave its first Common Core assessments last spring. New York, by the way, took Race to the Top money, earned and took Race to the Top money, so it made an extremely well-funded and concerted effort to prepare for the Common Core. New Jersey does not have Race to the Top money and is much less prepared. This is the result of New York's extensive preparation. Oh, by the way, I'm not going to read these slides. You read them. So this is the first result. So 68% of the students in New York State did not meet the standards. The achievement gap splits were extreme. I'm going to come back to that. Even worse, if you start to look at ELL, 90+% did not meet the standards. And special needs, 90+% did not meet the standards. And I'm not even at the bad part yet. These are the 5 biggest cities in New York. Look at Rochester. 95% of the kids did not meet the standards. And in some schools in Buffalo, 0% of the kids met the standards. So if we're looking from across the river at a state that had spent a lot of money and a lot of time thinking about the Common Core, something to think about. One thing that the Common Core has emphasized or brought forth or made clear are these achievement gap splits. This was an op-ed in the Washington Post from a New York, I'm not sure, state or city principal of the year. And she pointed to a chart, you must know, that I found absolutely fascinating. She was talking about testing. This is a chart that correlates family income and SAT scores. So the basic answer is if you want to do better on the SAT, have more money. That is the simple and most direct correlation. Want to do well, have more money. So it seems to me that the Common Core tests have served as a kind of X-ray for the splits and divisions and issues that we know exist. Common Core shows that these things matter. They matter in educational outcomes. They matter incredibly significantly. The next slide I showed to my class today, you see I just did this slide, but this is 2 articles in the New York Times in the past 2 days. The great thing is we've now started to compare American adults to their peers around the world. Instead of just comparing American kids to their peers, let's compare American adults. And what we see in American adults is what we just saw in the Common Core tests of kids. Extreme splits, wider than splits elsewhere. The top tier is at the best level of the world. The bottom tier is actually worse off than their peers in the test group. And this is reflected, this is all, the other New York Times article, that our workers do not, our workers now, we're talking about people actually in the job force, do not have the same level of technical skill as their peers in other countries, in aggregate. So the question is, what should we do about it? So from Lenin's point of view, we should change income gaps, unlikely to happen, or unlikely that we in this room can do much about that. So the question is, what can we do? So I say this, and I don't think, we probably disagree about this. Yes? I'm actually going to talk about, in this talk, 2 schools in New York that have done relatively well. But first thing you have to know is in fact, very few states have so far given the assessments. So we don't have a national picture. But Peggy, do you know of cases like that?
No, like Dr. Anderson said, I mean, there are states that are doing better with lower students, so Massachusetts probably on that. But we're still going to see these wide gaps that nationalize when we were really
Massachusetts right now is the Bow example for everything. And in fact, the Common Core standards were in part based on Massachusetts standards. I mean, Massachusetts is doing the best job. And in a short word, they set high standards for everybody. They say, we all have to get here. You're starting here, you have this assistance, but the expectation is for us all to get there. And that's been what Massachusetts has led the way. So I'm going to come back to this, but pause. I'm not advertising Coca-Cola, I'm just saying pause. I want to talk a little bit now about Common Core. So what exactly, we were talking about Common Core, Common Core. What does the Common Core require? Because remember, it's a set of skills. It's not a curriculum. Each state continues to set its own curriculum, and each state, by the way, can even vary on the Common Core by 15%. So there is variation. Well, here is the 3 shifts that are the heart of the ELA Common Core. We call them shifts because they are a new degree of emphasis. These are the 3 things that Common Core asks us to give renewed emphasis to. And I'm bringing this up, and all of this leads into, because this is crucial to what a librarian needs to do in her school or public library. So let's look at what these are. Peggy's going to talk about text complexity, which is another part of it. So why this, how many of you know anything about hockey? Okay, in hockey there's a term that I love, which is changing on the fly. Changing on the fly is when your lines shift in hockey, but they're shifting in the middle of the play. So the idea is, in football, you know, the referee blows the whistle and very large, heavy people go off the field and other very large people come on the field. In hockey, it's all going at the same time. And to me, that's Common Core, because the challenge for us as librarians, as teachers, as administrators, is changing as much as we're teaching young people to deal with new things. The change is universal. It's going on for everyone at the same time. We and they are having to evaluate information whose final nature we don't yet know. And to me, that means we have to become masters of information in its 3 meanings. And here are the 3 meanings of information. One is, you can see I do this with kids. And this is my favorite version of information, because to me it is the most obscure of all. I don't understand how something can have a 0 dress size, but apparently it can, and how the same dress size can mean 2 completely different things from 2 different manufacturers. And I call this lepidoptery. It's pinning things down precisely. That's one meaning of information, getting what is this. Second meaning of information, if you split the word, is organizing information. You put it in ranks, in tables, in chronology, in maps. You take all those bits and you put them into form. And then the third, my favorite part of all this, is things taking shape. Juxtaposition, how one thing, this is a Margaret Burke White photo from the Depression. So the question is, how do we map those 3 kinds of information against the 3 shifts that I mentioned in the Common Core? Well, here it is in outline, and then I'll go into it in some detail. So let's look at the first thing, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. So the first question is, as you would all know, what's knowledge? What's content-rich? So in the past, a lot of the way we imparted knowledge to young people was through textbooks. But textbooks aren't books. Textbooks are teaching devices. They don't have authors. They don't have point of view. They're tools. So at this point, we come to my favorite subject that I bring up in every lecture. You all know Moore's Law, right? So this is Moore's Law as a graph, and that's Moore's Law as a set of outputs. And so the point is that in a world of Moore's Law, what we need to teach young people is a process of knowing, because that which they will need to know is constantly changing. And what Common Core is saying, we've got to, from the youngest age, inculcate in young people what is this process of knowing, whatever it needs to be applied to. So any librarian who should be seeing herself in this. This is what you know how to do. The second thing is content-rich nonfiction. What does content-rich nonfiction mean? What it means is that in the past, when we selected nonfiction for school libraries or for public libraries to help support schools, it was generally of two sorts. It was either good for reports, which is, I detest the term. The new idea is nonfiction that leads you to another connection. It's not the end of your journey, it's the beginning of your journey. It leads you to look further for new ideas, new connections, new sources, new inquiry, that it keeps expanding rather than being this kind of lunchable, one-stop, you're good to go. So, what a librarian needs to think about is she knows how materials connect, how to select materials that allow a student to juxtapose one view against another, one set of evidence against another, or how to take a student who has this interest and give that student a ladder of resources so they can go further and further and further as their interest develops. These are all things that should be in the wheelhouse of a librarian. But now I have to give you guys a little test. So can any of you name an author that you think requires reading or rereading for young people of any age? Can you think of an author whose work requires or inspires rereading? There you've got C.S. Lewis. There's an obvious. Here's some selections, right? All of these are plausible selections that a young person might well want to, you might find an opportunity to return and find more. Okay, now the test. Can you name a nonfiction author who requires and rewards rereading? And my bet is no. I bet if you were to go to, I don't know how many schools and speak to the librarians and teachers, you would get to hear pretty quickly. You'll get to hear pretty quickly, too, on nonfiction. The fact is that while rereading or close reading is the key to Common Core, and while the Common Core places increased emphasis on nonfiction, very few, if any, of the people in the school building who deal with ELA, from the librarians to the teachers, know their nonfiction. Yes? Anne Frank, okay, Anne Frank is one example you can give. Although, you know, she was a very, very good writer and wanted to become a writer. That was the goal she had for herself. But Anne Frank is, that's actually a good, that's good. That's good. One. Not bad. I like that. A good example. So in the past, when we shared nonfiction with young people, especially in the elementary grades, it was either this sort of quick, fast, and in a hurry, you know, everything you need here, or we said of the nonfiction that it reads like fiction. To me, those two phrases, those two approaches, meant that we basically didn't like nonfiction, that it was good to get it out of the way, or it almost isn't nonfiction, and that we didn't have an idea of what is difficult as a positive. What's something that requires and rewards the kind of deep thinking that we want young people to engage in. So the question I ask to anybody who's going to work with young people in a Common Core context is, how can we help young people to do the kind of reading we're saying they need to do if we don't know how to do it? If we don't have a rich understanding of nonfiction reading. So as a first step, I think I urge everybody who might work with kids or in either school or in a public library that supports a school is getting to know the nonfiction that's there. Now let me break Common Core apart, and this is to your question. I started to interview in New York schools that had some success with the Common Core. So there's a school called Lab Middle, very well. And so here's the first thing they did. They spent 2 years developing the curriculum, which the teachers took the lead. The principal gave the job to the teachers, who became the experts. For the librarians, the Common Core was thought about through all the reading in all the classes. So as a librarian was thinking about books or materials that would support a class, for every class, math, physics, phys ed, whatever it was, she was thinking about it with a Common Core lens. And for students, this is what's astonishing. 40% of the kids in the school did better on the Common Core tests than they had done on the prior year's assessments. These are the same tests where we had in Rochester, 95% of the kids didn't pass. So obviously there's something very different in the kids, but also in what the kids were doing. And what it did, it captured how they already read. And you know how they read? They read for the main point, the supporting points, the evidence, the argument, and the point of view. This is what Common Core is asking kids to read in terms of it. And what I love about this, by the way, is it fits the world I mentioned of knowledge as a process of knowing. Because when you can read this way, you can read anything this way. It doesn't matter whether it says that the solar system has 9 planets or 14. You know how to read that claim. You're not looking for the nugget, you're looking for the thinking. And that's how these kids at that school read. And this is how the school supported those kids in this kind of thinking. The school was filled, this is the phrase. Oh, I'm sorry, and then they were able to articulate that in writing, but this is the phrase that characterized everything they used in the school. Argumentative text. Across all classes, students were comparing and contrasting points of view and argument and getting used to that kind of reading and thinking. Which, by the way, means, as I was saying to my class today, you should take this same approach to the Common Core. It just is encouraging this constantly questioning approach as something that we need to inculcate in young people. So that idea of knowledge in formation and how it has to characterize the whole school. And really what we're starting to work on here at Rutgers, Kay mentioned those 2 events on the 5th, December 5th and February 7th, is we're starting to work, just as Peggy was kind enough to come here today, we're starting to work with the ed school here so that we can think about how can the librarian be trained to work with the teacher, be trained to work with the principal, so that the whole school is manifesting an approach rather than each being trained separately, going to their separate professional development with separate lessons and ideas. So this is a question for anyone who is going to work in a school. Is this what your library is filled with? Is this what's characterized, what young people come to expect? We were just talking about this in class today. Are parents going to be upset if they come into the into a library and see an op-ed for some point of view they disagree with? Yes. But should school be a place where you're exposed to those opinions? Yes. School is not just to reinforce a parent's point of view. It's to help you think. Whatever point of view you arrive at. You want to go to a parochial school, military academy, whatever, go ahead. But if you're in a public school, you're in a place whose goal is to teach you to think. These are all things I can come back to in a minute. But this is something, again, I strongly urge. I don't think the professionals know their nonfiction. And actually something we should talk about, because one thing I hear very often is the ELA teachers don't know how to assess nonfiction reading, especially in elementary school. They simply have no training. And so they tell the kids you have to read a novel because they simply can't, they don't know what to do when someone comes back reading the Guinness Book of World Records. So it becomes non-reading. And yes. No, please. Yes, this is not doing nonfiction. Yes. In fact, there is a terrific site called Engage New York. As I said, New York got a lot of Race to the Top money, and this is from the New York DOE, a terrific site. And on there they list all the kinds of materials that could be useful for the Common Core. Manuals, instruction guides, newspapers, op-ed, all of that is explicitly listed as part of the kind of reading that. Oh, I didn't give the standard slide. By the Common Core, 50% of reading in elementary school is nonfiction. That's across all the classes. 55% in middle school, and by senior high school, that's 70%. So nonfiction better be all over the place. But the problem is in the younger grades, what I've found, and again, Peggy knows better than I do, where teachers are teaching literacy, some teachers, too often I've found, tell the kids you have to read a novel. And it's partially because I think they actually don't know how to assess as a literacy question, your comprehension and your understanding and your vocabulary, whatever the issues are, in a purely nonfiction text. And that's a problem. That's a teacher problem, not a student problem. Of course. I recommend when I give this talk in schools, I say after every important game in your part of the world, find out how that game was written about in the city that won or state, and how it was written about in the city or state that lost, and have the students read it. The game just happened, right? It happened last night. And how did the winning city describe it? How did the losing city describe it? Compare the rhetoric, the argument, etc. All of those tools are well within what can be used. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. So this is exactly it. I mean, to me, these are all kinds of things that fit perfectly with Common Core. We were talking about this in our class. Syria is a great subject because who the heck knows what to do? It's not like causes of World War I. We can't map out what later happened. We can map out the current crisis. But that's what kids have to think about. It's their life. And this is where I was beginning to talk about different tracks. My belief, and again, you're in this world more than I am, but I want to see Common Core vocational education. I want to see if we can find a way to inculcate Common Core kind of thinking for people who on leaving high school are going to go straight to work. And that we're going to help them get those jobs that will give them a reasonable income and a reasonable future. So this is something I'm in favor of. I'd be interested to hear your take on it. So here's the second example. This is IS 52. It's in Inwood, the tip of Manhattan. 60% ELL, that's 97% Dominican, and 15% special needs. Their overall test scores were down, but I met the principal, who is the most inspiring guy. Have you met Sal? He won the prize for being the principal in New York who did most to support teachers. And his focus, and it's something to think about in school, is he said, I don't care how the school did overall. I want to see if different cohorts, the weakest students, got a little better. He looked for improvement within cohorts rather than the overall score. And he said his whole school-wide focus was on what he calls the 3 C's. So if you go here, you can see it. There's a YouTube. This is a great story. He was leading me around the school, and I came to the music room, and the marching band was practicing. And he was very proud because it's one of, I think, the only 2 marching bands in all of Manhattan. And they were playing merengue. And so I said to the music teacher, how'd you get merengue orchestrated for marching band? And he said, I flew down to the Dominican Republic, I listened to the music, I interviewed the people, and I arranged it myself. And here's the YouTube where you can see the kids playing merengue as marching band, and it is so exciting. And it was just a beautiful example of someone doing something right. Then he is now starting to build his library. And the first thing he did is he weeded it. And that's one thing I have to say, that I think school libraries have a lot of dead wood in it. And I think a lot of it dead wood, paper, but it's also, I think a lot of librarians are scared to throw things out because they don't have the budget to buy anything new, and they're afraid to have nothing. But I think that's a mistake. I think with the internet, you have access to tremendous resources. So your print shelves should be the print you believe in, the print that's excellent, the print that really supports the kids, and then use digital resources to enhance and with that. And now he's looking for a librarian. So to me, here are 2 examples. The lesson in one case, argumentative text, enhancing the reading style the students already have. Here it was looking for the progress you can find within cohorts rather than the overall score. As Joe Hill said, don't mourn, unionize. So I'm saying don't mourn, organize, make friends. And this is the next thing that I want to talk to some of you who may become public librarians. Parents are really important because they don't know much about Common Core. And the parents who select books for kids are most generally mothers who also may not know nonfiction as well as they know fiction. And here is an extremely recent Bowker survey, and it had some fascinating results. Where do people get their books ages 7 to 12? They get it from public libraries. However, that is declining. Here's the thing that's rising. Parents are deciding on their own what books to get for their kids. Library and teacher influence down. People making decisions on their own. And so, but here's the next interesting thing. Parents are buying more nonfiction, from 11 to 15%. What kind of that's boys over girls. Again, nonfiction, boys, over 36% of what they're buying. But what are they buying? Basically subjects, you know, my son likes dinosaurs basically, or celebrity author. They're making a retail decision, right? What's easy to buy. They don't think of the library as the place that will help them to understand what would be a good nonfiction choice, even as they're recognizing nonfiction as something they need. To me, that suggests that librarians need to step forward and make visible to teachers, to parents, that they know nonfiction, or at the least, they know how to know, and that they are the resource that people should be relying on. So here's my overall description. Common Core leads to these extreme splits. There are the three shifts that are central: argumentative text central, the librarian as the hub of information, outreach to the parents. And this is something I was just mentioning in class today. All of you recognize, I'm sure, that what Common Core wants is what you know how to do. But it is also true that school librarian jobs all over the country are deeply endangered. And that's why it seems to me it falls on the prospective librarian to make her visible, to make her skills visible, to make herself central to the conversation. And that is this is the good news, to keep with the apostle, that you need to be bringing out into the world. And so to me, doing all this has two possible outcomes, and both of them are better. So that's what I have to say for you for now as my introduction, and then now you'll get something that's actually concrete and useful.
So Mark gave a really nice introductory overview of what the Common Core is about, what it represents for us, some of the challenges that it presents. And today, I really want to hone in on one particular element of these shifts, the three shifts that you highlighted, that the Common Core ushers in. The first was the greater emphasis on informational text, nonfiction. The second was the close reading of text, or a real emphasis on helping young people prepare for college and career by drawing on evidence in text, in both literary and informational text. So that's the second shift. But the third shift that I really want to focus in on for my purposes is this this call for an increasing emphasis on complex text. And that is in the language of the Common Core. It's everywhere in Common Core related discussions. So I just want to focus in on that issue and try to take it apart a bit. And look at what are the Common Core authors talking about when they talk about complex text, and what does that mean for the work of teachers, librarians, and so forth. Where does this emphasis on complex text fit in the big picture? So we're talking about the English language arts standards, and they are divided into these four broad areas. They are reading, writing, listening and speaking, and language. And the call for emphasis on complex text really appears primarily in the section on reading. So that's where you would see this language of complex text. Even though, of course, we're asking young people to be writing in relation to the complex text that they're reading, to be engaging in rich conversations around that text. But it's really in these reading standards that you'll find that language. Now, as Mark really highlighted, the Common Core is designed with the end in mind. And the end are these standards that are identified as anchor standards, which are the eventual outcomes for high school graduation and movement into college and or career. And the anchor standards for reading, so this is the end game, you can see are divided into how young people should feel comfortable drawing on key ideas or identifying main ideas and details in a text, that they're able to draw conclusions based on close reading, determine central ideas and themes. I won't go into all the details here. There's another part of the reading standards that focuses on the actual craft and structure of text, of literature, how text is organized, the language of the text, and so forth. And of course, the knowledge and ideas that are represented, author's point of view, comparison of different texts on similar topics. But you can see that this final anchor standard, that's where this issue of text complexity comes in. And to just highlight that, the anchor standard asks that students leave high school, that they enter the next stage able to read and comprehend complex literary and informational texts independently and proficiently. So what exactly does that mean if we're talking about complex texts, and why is this anything new under the sun? Weren't they doing this all along? Isn't that what we've always been doing when we read? There is a whole body of research now that's been looking at some of the changes that have occurred in the published literature, in high school textbooks, in the kinds of things that children and youth are reading, that indicates that over the last 100 years, really, but particularly accelerated over the last 30, 40 years, that the texts that we're reading and asking young people to read have been getting consistently less complex. And there have actually been studies of late showing that among the top 40 most frequently assigned high school novels, that the average grade level equivalent for those texts is actually a 5th grade level. Or at least that's the, I guess that's the point of view that's been put forth by the Common Core authors, and it's worth really kind of dissecting this and looking at where does this suggestion come from. Certainly we can see, I don't know if you all have observed this, I feel as though I see it in the kinds of popular literature that fall under the, I guess, the middle school reading highlights. I see this decline in average text level, but we should look at it a little bit further to see where this comes from and to what degree this really is the case. The suggestion is that because there has been this decline over the years, that many students are coming out of high school not able to adequately read or proficiently read text at the complexity that they will encounter in college. And of course, if one compares the kinds of texts that are being read in an average grade 9 through 12 class with the demands of college and the workplace, we're seeing this real disconnect. And it's resulting in you know, upwards of 30–40% of students in freshman college classes requiring remedial classes just to, yes?
What levels besides like Lexiles are you really looking for?
Yes. No, I actually want to talk about Lexiles because this is one of the primary readability measures that's being used, and that's being used in making these kinds of assertions that you'll hear about, that you'll read about. But there is abundant evidence that students' ability to proficiently and comfortably manage and read complex text really is a very strong predictor of how well they will ultimately do in college-level classes, not just in four-year colleges, but in community colleges and in the workplace as well. So it really is an imperative that we're preparing students to feel comfortable reading adequately challenging text. And just to highlight this issue and to share with you a piece, did any of you hear by chance an NPR story that aired back in June on this topic? Yes, possibly. If you, I think it's really worth hearing again because it does kind of give a nice overview of the issue.
Walk into any bookstore or library and you'll find shelf after shelf of novels and series of books for kids. But what happens to those readers as they get older? Research shows that today's young readers do not move on to more complex books as they grow. High schoolers are reading books written for younger kids, and teachers aren't assigning as many difficult classics as they once did. NPR's Lynn Neary has that story as part of our month-long focus on media for young people.
At Woodrow Wilson High School in Washington, D.C., students are making their way into English class with copies of The Kite Runner tucked under their arms.
All right, so class, let me have your attention for a second.
This is an 11th grade honors English class, so it's not so surprising that students like Megan Bell are reading some heavy-duty books in their spare time.
I like a lot of old-fashioned type historical dramas. I just read Anna Karenina. I plowed through it and it was a really good book.
Most teens are not forging their way through Russian novels, says Walter Dean Myers, who is currently serving as National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. A popular author of young adult novels that are often set in the inner city, Myers wants his readers to see themselves in his books, but sometimes he's surprised by his own fan mail.
I'm glad they wrote, but it's not very heartening to see what they're reading as juniors and seniors.
What do you mean? What are they telling you they're reading?
Oh, they're reading books which I had initially written for 5th and 6th grade kids.
And a lot of kids who like to read in their spare time are more likely to be reading the latest vampire novel than the classics, says Anita Silvey, author of 500 Great Books for Teens. Silvey teaches graduate students in a children's literature program. At the beginning of the class, she asked her students, who grew up in the age of Harry Potter, what kinds of books they like.
Every single person in the class said, I don't like realism, I don't like historical fiction. What I like is fantasy, science fiction, horror, and fairy tales.
Those anecdotal observations are reflected in a study of kids' reading habits by Renaissance Learning. For the 5th year in a row, the educational company used its Accelerated Reader program to track what kids are reading in grades 1 through 12.
Last year we had more than 8.6 million students from across the country who read a total of 283 million books.
Eric Stickney is the Educational Research Director for Renaissance Learning. Students participate in the Accelerated Reader program through their schools. When they read a book, they take a brief comprehension quiz, and the book is then recorded in the system. The books are assigned a grade level based on vocabulary and the complexity of sentences.
Actually, by the time they hit late middle school, we don't see a lot of improvement or increase in the complexity or the difficulty of books that children are either choosing to read or being assigned to read.
Last year, almost all of the top 40 books read in grades 9 through 12 were well below grade level. The most popular books, the Hunger Games series, were assessed to be at the 5th grade level. And last year, for the first time, Stickney says, Renaissance did a separate study to find out what books are being assigned to high school students.
The complexity of text students are being assigned to read has gradually declined by about 3 grade levels over the past 100 years. A century ago, students were being assigned books with a complexity of around the 9th or 10th grade level, but in 2012, the average was around the 6th grade level.
Most of the assigned books are novels like To Kill a Mockingbird, Of Mice and Men, or Animal Farm, even such recent works as The Help and The Notebook. In 1989, works by Sophocles, Shakespeare, Dickens, George Bernard Shaw, Emily Bronte, and Edith Wharton were still being assigned in high school. Now, with the exception of Shakespeare, most classics have dropped off the list. Back at Woodrow Wilson High School, classes are changing. A 10th grade English class is getting underway. This is a regular English class, and a lot of these kids say they don't read much outside of school. But Tyler Jefferson and Adriel Miller are eager to talk. Adriel likes books about sports. Tyler likes history. Both say their teachers have assigned books that they would not have chosen on their own.
I read the Odyssey. I read Romeo and Juliet. I didn't read Hamlet.
What did you think of those books?
It was very different because how the language was back then. Yeah, the dialogue that they had, and
Was it harder to read than?
yes, it was. It was harder to comprehend also.
You agree? I mean, that when you get those kinds of books, that they're harder to read.
Most definitely. You know, that's why we have great teachers to actually make us understand. And
So you think it's a good thing to be assigned those kinds of books?
yes, ma'am. It gives us a harder challenge of our brain, you know?
Yeah,
It gives
and
us a challenge.
It gives a new view on things.
Sandra Stotsky would be heartened to hear that. Professor Emerita of Education at the University of Arkansas, Stotsky firmly believes that high school students should be reading challenging fiction to get ready for the reading they will have to do in college.
You wouldn't find words like malevolent, malicious, or incorrigible necessarily in science or history materials.
Stotsky says in the 60s and 70s, schools began introducing more accessible books in order to motivate kids to read. That trend has continued, she says, and the result is kids get stuck at a low level of reading.
Kids were never pulled out of that particular mode to realize that in order to read more difficult works, you really have to work at it a little bit more. You've got to broaden your vocabulary. You may have to use a dictionary occasionally. You've got to do a lot more reading altogether.
There is something wonderful about the language, the thinking, the intelligence of the classics.
Children's book expert Anita Silvey. Silvey says schools and parents may need to work a little harder to get kids to read the classics these days, but that doesn't mean kids shouldn't continue to read the popular contemporary novels they love. Both have value.
There's an emotional, psychological attraction to books for readers. And I think some of particularly these dark, dystopic novels that predict a future where, in fact, the teenager is going to have to find the answers. I think these are very compelling reads for these young people right now.
Reading leads to reading, says Silvey. It's when kids stop reading or never get started in the first place that there's no chance of ever getting them hooked on more complex books. Lynn Neary, NPR News, Washington.
So that's kind of a broad sweep of how the issues being discussed in the media, and does that sound like a familiar argument if some of you encountered that elsewhere? I mean, it is out there. I think that there is certainly much truth to it. It's really a question of how do we address that when ultimately what we want to do is keep kids engaged in reading. We want them to read. We want them to read things that they love and that attract them. So then the question is, how do we address this challenge of increasing demands for reading complex text? And these are just some of the titles that actually do appear on the list of some of the most widely assigned readings in grade 9 through 12 ELA classes. You can see The Hunger Games is it was actually the #1 most widely assigned title on the most recent survey, and it had a Lexile level, and I'm going to talk in a moment about what that means, of that had the equivalent, according to the new Common Core guidelines, of a 5th to 6th grade level. So let's just look, these are some of the other reads, at what that means. What is the Common Core telling us? Where are they getting these standards for grade level match to text complexity? The basic idea is that we want students to be able to read and comprehend proficiently, independently by the time they move on from high school. And that requires a steady kind of graduated increase in the complexity of texts that we expose children to, that we ask them and help them to read. The Common Core provides benchmark guidelines for how we can do that. So let's just look at how it's doing that. Okay, so there was a question before from someone in a remote audience about Lexile level. One of the primary means or measures that's being used to determine the complexity of text is known as its Lexile level. The Common Core actually includes documents that, appendices, Appendix A, Appendix B, you'll see those attached to the English Language Arts Common Core guidelines that provide this table where these targets for text complexity are presented in what are known as grade level bands. So you can see for grades 2 to 3, the Lexile ranges that are Common Core aligned, they gradually increase over the years up through 11th and 12th grade. CCR stands for just college and career readiness. So what is a Lexile? It is a common scale for measuring the difficulty of a text, as well as a reader's comprehension. It is actually the most widely adopted measure in use today in New Jersey and around the country. I saw a recent estimate that each year about half of all public school students are given some form of Lexile assessment, which is just dramatic. That kind of blew my mind, because half of all students is, this is a relatively recent development in education that this measure is being so widely used. The value of Lexiles is that they really can help us. They can help teachers, they can help librarians to match students with appropriate texts, at least appropriate in terms of their readability, and to do that using a common scale. An individual student's Lexile score is typically measured using something called the Scholastic Reading Inventory, or SRI. This is a computer adaptive reading comprehension assessment. So children read passages, they answer a series of questions. As they are successful, the complexity level increases, or the reverse is also true. So I guess the key takeaway here would be that Lexile is something that is typically attached to a child based on an assessment. So let's say this young reader has a Lexile score of 810. That is a measure of her comprehension level. But Lexiles are also attached to individual texts. So A Wrinkle in Time has a Lexile measure of 740. And it's by looking for that match that, so goes the theory, we have some sense of how well a reader is matched to a particular text. The basis for determining the Lexile of any particular text is really quite limited. It's based on sentence length, and it's based on vocabulary, the prevalence of higher and lower frequency words. So the more low frequency words a text has, the higher its Lexile. The longer and more complex its sentences, the higher its Lexile. It's believed that the best range, or the ideal range for students to be reading, is from about 100 Lexiles below their level to 50 above. So it's about a 150-point range. To what degree is that really the case? We could certainly argue that, since we know, yes?
It seems self-evident to me that this is more apt for fiction than nonfiction, because in nonfiction there'll be infrequently used terms because you're learning about dinosaurs or the digestive system or, you know, black holes using terms that are specific to that discipline, right? And so, and it says in the Common Core kids are supposed to learn disciplinary language, and so I worry that there's a mismatch there.
I mean, and yet there is the kind of widely held belief, and you know, we can discuss to what degree this is true, that reading nonfiction is in fact more difficult for many students. And one of the reasons that that is sometimes the case is because the vocabulary is...
But I guess my subjective experience and anecdotal experience is that it's also easier for some students for two reasons. One, engagement, and two, it's structure.
Yes.
It provides you know where you are, right? You know, the book gives you a universe to live in.
Yes. So there are other features of complex nonfiction that make it more accessible. And in a minute, we'll try to kind of go, no, that's okay, to go beyond Lexile levels to see that the Common Core doesn't reduce the text complexity issue exclusively to Lexiles. But I do think it's important for librarians to know what this means. Students are going to be coming into libraries looking for books at a particular Lexile level. Schools will ask librarians to organize books, at least for some purposes, around Lexile levels. So it's just important to know that that's out there, what it means, and how it's related to the Common Core. But that it is, you know, it's reductionist in the sense that it is simply one quantitative measure of text complexity, and there are many other characteristics of a text that determine how accessible that text really is to a young person. But just to kind of try your hand at this, so just read the first couple of sentences, see to what, first of all, what's the source of this? We are talking fiction here for a moment. So what's the text source? Yes, okay, Charlotte's Web. Any guesstimates as to what might be the kind of grade level band for which Charlotte's Web is considered a Common Core aligned text? Third grade? Lexile 680, grade level band 2-3. So yes, this is considered a grade level text for about third grade. And you'll see it appear on reading lists. You'll see it also appear on lists for recommended read alouds. But there's no reason this text couldn't be a wonderful read aloud for much younger children than third grade. Whereas the third graders are getting to the place where they can read this independently. Okay, so how about this one? Yeah, this is the Hunger Games. And you already heard the suggestion that Hunger Games actually fits within that grade 4-5 Lexile band with a Lexile of 8-10. This is actually a really good illustration of some of the limitations of Lexile, because obviously Hunger Games with its content isn't a read that you would want to have in a grade 4-5 classroom. Are there 4th and 5th graders who are out there reading it? Yes, in abundance. But as an assigned text, it's actually been, I've seen pretty wide adoption of Hunger Games in 7th grade classrooms. or as an 8th grade read. Okay, one final example, actually two final examples. Okay, now we're getting increasingly complex. In my younger, more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice. I've been turning over my mind ever since. Any guesses? Catcher in the Rye, good guess, not? Great Gatsby? And now, okay, so now a little bit more complex, slightly more complex vocabulary. Lexile 1070 for Great Gatsby, and we're up into the grades 6 to 8 Lexile band. And one final example.
All right, so that we know.
Yeah, Metamorphosis, right? Okay, Kafka. And here we are at Lexile 1320. Okay, we're almost at the top of the scale, grade level band 11, 12. Okay, and you can see some of the vocabulary. Look at the sentence length now. He lay on his armor-hard back. As he lifted his head up a little, his brown arched abdomen divided into rigid bow-like sections. So you're starting to see these increasingly complex sentences, increasingly less familiar or less widely used vocabulary. And those are the markers of these higher Lexile books. But here's where we get into the but and the limitations of these purely quantitative measures of text complexity. Because Common Core is not suggesting that we make decisions regarding a child-appropriate text or a grade-level appropriate text simply based on Lexiles. We are to look at, first of all, qualitative measures related to a text. For example, the structure of a text. You mentioned nonfiction texts often have rich text features, organization, insets, subheadings, photographs, captions, things that help children make sense of the text that aren't quantifiable and that make more complex text accessible to younger readers. Clarity, knowledge demands, and so forth. So there are the qualitative measures. Then, of course, there are these quantitative measures of readability that include Lexile. It might include other leveled text systems. You all have perhaps heard of Fountas and Pinnell's system of leveled reading, where you get these A through Z guided reading levels. So you might have a child come into a library and say, well, I'm a J. I need to find J books. And unfortunately, very often when kids are assessed, they attach this label to themselves. And they've been told, you must read these books. And it really has many disadvantages, I think, in terms of building independence and joy for reading. But nonetheless, they are out there. And finally, of course, and perhaps most importantly, the reader. What is this child bringing to the selection and choice about what to read? What background knowledge, what individual interests, what motivations? And we know, the reading comprehension research literature abounds with evidence that we can read much more complex text when it's on a topic that we are highly motivated to read about or that we're very interested in. So, there's the nonfiction piece once again.
You can check the reading level of your own writing in Microsoft Word. They use Flesch Kincaid. How is that?
You can check the text.
They use the Flesch Kincaid measure. Have you heard that?
I haven't seen that particular way of doing it. I know you can take any piece of text, and I would imagine your own writing, and you can plug it into some of these readability measures, and you can instantly get a Lexile measure. So it is possible. And if you ever encounter text And many texts don't have Lexiles attached to them. And you want to know, well, is this appropriate for this grade level or for this child? You can use some of these online tools to just get pretty instant assessments of a Lexile or readability level. And that gets back to, again, what kids say about why they're choosing what they're choosing to read. A child choosing a nonfiction text about Lincoln, an 8th grader, I did a report about him and thought his life was interesting. So these are the non-quantifiable forces behind children's choice of reading. Nonetheless, there are references, and this is one of the key kind of go-to documents. If you're interested in learning more about what are some suggested or recommended texts that kind of match these demands for text complexity in these grade level bands, they are attached to the Common Core at this particular website. You can access it at any website around the English Language Arts Common Core standards.
Just one quick caution for librarians. That was gathered in 2010, and many of the books are not available.
Are not available. Okay, and it won't have been updated since then. I mean, there has been much debate about the text exemplars that appear in this document. And yet, you know, if one takes it simply as that which it purports to be, which is a set of examples, I see no problem with it. Could it be more multicultural? Absolutely. Could it be, you know, more rich in women's voices? Most likely, yes. But as a starting point, as simply a set of examples, it does provide those exemplars for fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and so forth. This is another level of text complexity, or another system for measuring text complexity that you're likely to encounter out there. It's widely used in New Jersey schools, and that is the Fountas and Pinnell guided reading system. And what you can see is that the determinations of a text's readability and a child's reading comprehension level using this system is based on far more elements, far more features than just the Lexile measure. But I think that Common Core has kind of pushed this aside for now and is really looking at those Lexiles as simply a streamlined way to assess complex text. So in terms of kind of what to do, I do think that ultimately it's using kids' interests as the primary driving force behind their choice of texts, but they are also certainly to be encouraged to read to their level of challenge. Because we know that if young people stay on a steady diet of these easier texts, of the easier popular novels that they love, they aren't pushing themselves, they aren't getting exposure to the challenge that's really needed to get proficient at the kinds of reading they need to do to go on to the next step. One strategy is often to encourage kids and or their parents to choose both a just right text, meaning a text that's matched to their Lexile or guided reading level, but also to choose a challenge book, to choose a book that does fit in the grade level band. Because we know that if it's about a topic that's of interest to children, they will take the time. They can sit down, they can make sense of it. We can encourage them to just kind of work with it in smaller chunks, in bite-sized chunks. That very often it's about, you know, more closely focusing on a smaller chunk of text rather than kind of watering down the level of challenge. And ultimately, we really want to encourage kids to monitor their own comfort level and comprehension so that they can walk into a library and open any book and know, is this good for me? Rather than, does this match the number that has been assigned to me? I think that's really probably the greatest downside of these guided reading systems or Lexile systems when that information is given to children, is that they often use it as a constraint and come to rely on it to choose reading material rather than just kind of assessing for themselves, how well am I understanding this? Is this making sense? And if so, I can work with it. And then, back to this issue of the classics, I think that a nice kind of pairing of classics with some of the more popular titles, whether it's around themes or topics, pairing Hunger Games with Lord of the Flies, taking things that have this dystopic theme and presenting them as a package. That's a way to kind of keep the classics in the loop for kids, but give them, a contemporary flavor at the same time. So we're coming up to the end of time here, so why don't we just open for questions, and I will post online a video clip that's a really nice example from a 5th grade classroom of a teacher helping students to work with complex text in a way that I think actually drives home this issue of just how children really can, with support and encouragement, rise to the challenge of texts that may be viewed as above their readability level, but nonetheless are considered at grade level and Common Core aligned. So are there questions that... Well, first, thank you very much. Oh.